So for a few hundred years now, most weapons have been made predominantly of metals of various sort. But recently we looked at a whole bunch of amazing weapons from human history made of wood, and you can make some pretty awesome weapons from wood. And I'm sure we're going to revisit that topic again soon, because there's some awesome weapons made of wood that I didn't cover in that video. But if you haven't watched it yet, check it out. But now in this video, we're going to look at some of the amazing weapons from around the world throughout history that have used rock. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria, and that's right, in this video we've looked previously at wooden weapons. We're going to look at weapons that have used various types of rock. So I'm guessing everybody who's watched my previous video, and indeed is now watching this video, is aware of the fact that we have something that we colloquially know as the Stone Age. So clearly stone has been used by humans all around the planet. It's been very, very important for weapons throughout human existence. But because rock, or rather stone, spearheads and arrowheads are so prevalent throughout human history and prehistory, we're not going to be really looking at those here. We're going to look at some specific weapons that are somewhat different to just a simple arrowhead or just a simple spear tip. So we're going to quickly go through 10 awesome stone weapons, or at least weapons that use stone in their construction, some of which you may have heard of, some of which you may not have done. But before we do, a quick word about our sponsor for this video. Now today's sponsor for this channel is a fantastic one, because I know that thousands of you are huge fans of the Warhammer universe. So you need to check out Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus. It's the fast-paced battlefield strategy game that you can have in the palm of your hand wherever you go. You can assemble and lead over 80 legendary Warhammer 40,000 champions, for a whopping 18 from playable factions. Personally, I've always loved the Eldari. I love the way they look and I love the lore. The game's constantly growing, new game modes and exciting events. Officially licensed by Games Workshop, and with an average score of 4.5 in the app stores. If you want top quality strategic gaming, then check out Tacticus. So the massive news for June 2025 is the introduction of the Adeptus Custodes. These were created as the Emperor's personal bodyguard, and each custodian is basically worth an army by themselves. They're unbreakable and unyielding, and they fight to the last. And there's a new champion, who is the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. Trajan Valoris is reckoned to be the greatest Captain General ever to have led them. There are so many ways to enjoy Tacticus. You've got in-game missions, you've got person versus person live events, and guild raids as well. And of course, with the addition of that new faction, there's never been a better time to get playing. So you can get playing right now using my link down below in the description or on screen here, or with that QR code, and you're gonna absolutely love it. So the first weapon in the list, we're gonna have a quick look again at the Maui Pu, also known as a mere, I think it's pronounced. And this is a weapon that I actually featured in my previous video looking at wooden weapons, because, surprise, surprise, they can be made of wood, like this example here, or even whalebone, or indeed different types of stone. So therefore they're actually a really brilliant example of a stone hand weapon. Now, as mentioned previously, these could be used as striking weapons, thrusting weapons, particularly at the side of the head apparently, and also involving grabbing and striking at the same time. I know that's very graphic, but in addition, they also sometimes used to use parrying devices with the left hand while striking with the Patu in the right hand, or I guess the other way around if they were left-handed. So this was a close combat weapon, and it was reckoned to be a match even for some of the longer pole weapons used by the Maoris, if it was used by a skilled person. In fact, these often had a status role in society, in Maori society as well, and were often carried by chiefs, and we often see them represented both in photographs taken in the 19th century and other artwork. Now, the stone examples basically break down into two main categories. There's the typical stone examples, and they tend to be somewhat chunkier, but they still are edged all the way around, so you can sort of thrust with the end of them with the axe-like end, or indeed you can strike and chop with the narrowed edges which focus the force, or indeed there's the more prestigious and, in the collecting world, more sought after greenstone varieties. Now, while we do have asymmetrical examples like this one here, in fact a lot of the greenstone ones and a lot of the other stone ones are actually symmetrical, kind of paddle-like in shape, usually have a bulbous knob at the back end which stops your hand from sliding off, and pretty much always have a hole going through for the attachment of a wrist loop, essentially, for retention. This can also mean that you can carry the thing while using other weapons as well. So if you're using a firearm, which of course they did use from the 18th century onwards, or if you're using a pole weapon of some kind, then you can have this as a quick backup. So it's a good, well, fantastic sidearm, incredibly useful. Could be made of various types of stone, and the most prestigious ones were those greenstone ones, and they could be made thinner and debatably therefore sharper. Now of course stones have also been used for a variety of different types of maces and axes throughout human history across the world. But one really famous example, before we get into the rarer ones which you might not have heard of that we're going to look at, is the North American Stoneheaded mace. Or we could call it a tomahawk, in fact. So this is the predecessor to the types of iron or steel or sometimes brass-headed hatchet that became popular as a result of European trade. And this is the type that was around before the Europeans turned up, essentially in North America. Now, this is a type probably associated with the Lakota, with the Sioux, and particularly made famous in the wars in the American plains in the latter part of the 19th century. However, it is a type of fighting weapon that was actually used by a whole range of different tribes right the way across North America, from east to west, and of course with the migration of peoples from east to west as the Europeans came in, this weapon was carried with them. Now there are a few subtly different varieties of these, okay? So this type that we see here has a sort of oval style stone, and it will have a groove. You can't see it because it's inside, but it will have a groove which is essentially carved around the side of the stone, and then a loop of rawhide is put over the top and then bound down onto the shaft down here. And as it dries, that goes really tight, it contracts, and so this is like really tightly attached to the end of this shaft. However, some of these don't have the groove around and are attached in different ways. Some of them have different shafts of different lengths, different thicknesses, different materials as well. One type that we often see is where the stone is actually fully encapsulated within the rawhide or hide, so that you can't actually see the stone, but the stone is there, and that functions like a mace like this would. It's just a different type of construction, and you find certain types of construction more popular in certain areas of American Indian and other types more popular in other areas. And of course they were decorated in different ways according to tribal tastes. Another type which we occasionally see, which is very similar to that other type with the fully encased head, but you can sometimes have it with an exposed stone, actually has this section here flexible, so it acts a little bit like a flail, like we see in medieval Europe. But fundamentally stones, and obviously these are for the most part just naturally procured stones, probably from riverbeds and pebbles essentially, so they have been formed like that naturally, taken and attached to a shaft, and prior to the arrival of lots of firearms, often used with the shield on the left hand. So they would have been used absolutely similarly to a warhammer or a mace in any other part of the world from any other part of history. So very effective weapon, and these were still being carried alongside Winchester rifles and Colt Remington revolvers right the way through to the end of the 19th century, and are still used today in ceremonies, dances and things like this, and they're still being made by some people in North America. So maces have been incredibly popular and successful weapons throughout history and prehistory, from the stone-headed sort all the way through to the iron or steel types used by medieval knights. And as we have seen with the Sioux stone-headed mace, if we want to call it that, tomahawk here, this was a kind of almost unadulterated stone, so it's a pebble which has a groove put around it. But as you will see, there are many types of mace where the shaft goes through the middle of the striking head, however that should be made and whatever it should be made of. So the example we're going to look at here is from Papua New Guinea. Okay, so you will remember, hopefully if you've seen my video on wooden weapons, Papua New Guinea has, and the islands near it, has a whole load of fascinating, awesome organic weapons made primarily of wood, sometimes using other materials. But they also use a type of stone-headed mace, and in this case they actually bore the hole through the centre of the stone and mount the shaft into it, which makes it somewhat like a medieval metal mace where the head would be made of iron. Now, there are many cultures that have done this, but in Papua New Guinea there is a type of fighting mace called a kuku kuku. I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly. And these come in a number of different forms. The three most common forms, as far as I can see, is one type, it has kind of pointed projections front and rear, a little bit like a pick. One type is like a flattened disc, okay, like a UFO or like a flying saucer on the top of the shaft. And the other type looks a bit like a pineapple hand grenade or a Mills bomb. So it actually has these kind of segments on it. And all of these are made of stone. They all have a socket hole bored through the middle and have a wooden shaft. And these were really popular and quite high status weapons, because if you imagine a culture where most weapons are just made of wood, one which has a carved stone head is a pretty high status thing. So they're widely collected and sought after today by museums and collectors. Now, this next example of a stone weapon, I reckon some of you won't have ever heard of, but you really should have done. And it's known as the Hinsgavl Dagger. It's from Denmark and it's made of flint, but in the form of a Bronze Age dagger. And that's because this was the time when we're moving from the Neolithic period into the Bronze Age, and these types of Bronze Age daggers, I think they're sometimes referred to as fishtail daggers, had started to be imported into Denmark. We're talking about around 1900 to 1800 BC. And at this point, bronze daggers were incredibly rare, high status and expensive by the terms of the day. And therefore, if somebody wanted something like this and they didn't have the capacity to buy one, what they could do is commission a flint copy of one. Or at least that's one potential theory. We don't actually really know why these flint daggers were made, and this is probably the most famous example. But why someone should want to make a flint version of a Bronze Age dagger, because very clearly if you make a flint dagger in the same shape, form, proportions as a Bronze Age blade, it's going to be very fragile. Not to say you can't use it, but you'll probably be able to break it quite easily, and it's extremely time consuming and difficult to make. So potentially, and I know you're going to hate me for saying this, it may have had ritual significance. So it may possibly have been made as some type of votive offering, ceremonial object. It might not necessarily have been made as a direct replacement for one of the Bronze Age daggers. But anyway, whatever the reasons for it, it's an incredible object. It was discovered in the late 1800s, allegedly by a boy in a field, and it went through a series of museums and exhibitions and has ended up where it is today in the museum in Denmark. But I think it's a fantastic example of how when a new technology comes in, sometimes people cling to the past, at least material and technology, but they try and adapt to the new shapes with the old material. Absolutely fascinating find. And in fact, we have a range of these flint daggers, including the Grude dagger, which is perhaps not as kind of expertly made, but is certainly very long and very large, the Grude dagger. We have a bunch of flint daggers like this, which clearly were being made in the Bronze Age, partially in imitation of, partly perhaps even in competition with bronze daggers. So not only do we have flint daggers in imitation of bronze daggers, but we also have flint swords, and this is really pushing the envelope of what you can do with flint and how long you can make it. And we have something particularly called the Farskov scimitar, sometimes known as the Farskov scimitar or sometimes saber. Now, the Farskov scimitar, as it's often known, is incredibly fragile, and some people would argue it couldn't really be used as a weapon. It seems to be a status or perhaps ritual implement, but it's very clearly modelled on certain types of Scandinavian Bronze Age sword, like the Råby sword. So this family of so-called scimitars are made of bronze, and it is very clear that the Farskov flint sword is in imitation of these for whatever purposes. So it's another amazing example of people trying to make something out of stone, or in this case flint, modelled on metal technology. Now, in fact, flint can be made surprisingly thin and long. As you see here, this is actually a North American weapon which was donated to the channel by a viewer, and there'll be a dedicated video on this in due course. But there is clearly a size at which, rather thickness and length at which flint becomes too brittle to use. But the ancestors found an answer to this. So there's a type of sword, and this is an example which was found in a place I believe called Atta, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, in Jutland in Scandinavia. And this is made of a composite, so it's not all flint. So what they've done here is they've used flint blades, again in imitation of a bronze sword, which either they didn't have access to or they wanted to, you know, it was the flint makers trying to keep themselves in work, I don't know. But they've used flint blades right the way around a now lost organic central structure, which was probably wood, but it could have been something else like horn or bone even, or something like this. So these flint blades were attached around the edge. You'll notice you'll immediately be thinking of some other weapons, and we'll talk about those in a second, which use similar technology on an organic material core, which enables you to have a longer and more resilient blade, still with the sharpness and hardness and tip point acuteness of flint. And you probably guessed correctly by this point that no discussion of stone in weapons in history could possibly be complete without discussing the Makawito. Now the Makawito uses obsidian, which is volcanic glass, but it is classed as a type of rock as far as this video is concerned, and as far as science is concerned, as far as I'm aware. And a lot of people will associate this weapon with the Aztecs, because of course they're the people that most famously used the weapon against the Spanish that came in with their indigenous allies and fought against them. And however, this weapon, the fundamental weapon here, was actually used by a number of other peoples, including the Mayans, the Toltecs and various others. Now, one of the saddest things to say about the Makawito is we don't actually have any reliable extant examples surviving, unfortunately. There was one in a Spanish collection which unfortunately was destroyed in a fire in the, I think the 1880s, certainly anyway the late 1800s, but it does perhaps, or at least a relative of it, survives in photographs. Now what we can say about the Makawito by looking at contemporary art, also written descriptions, and this one potentially once surviving example, is they weren't of one particular size and shape. They came in a variety of forms. There was a smaller sort which was perhaps around the size of a Maui Pu, but completely edged all around the edges with little spiky bits of obsidian. There was the more typically sized, essentially one-handed sword, arming sword variety, and there was a long sword, or perhaps even a great sword variety. In fact, the example that we see photographs surviving of actually looks about the size of this Solomon Islands club, even not quite approaching, but almost approaching the size of a matante, which may have been used by the Spanish invaders. So in fact, it was more of a family. The Makawito was more of a family of weapons rather than one specific weapon, but they all had a consistent feature, and that was a body made of wood. Usually that wood was decorated, probably painted for the most part, perhaps even carved in some cases, with recesses, like almost like in your gums for teeth, for the teeth which were the obsidian blades. And the obsidian blades could be rectangular with a long straight cutting edge put in lines. They could have gaps between them, or indeed they could be pointed according to the art as well. And it looks like the smaller variety of Makawito probably had these types of more tooth-like blades in them. So a variety, a family of weapons. Sometimes they were two-handed weapons, and these are described in the texts as well, two-handed varieties. And sometimes, of course, used alongside shields, which we see in the Aztec art. We see them being used alongside shields as well. So it really, we're looking at more like a family of weapons, much akin to swords, everything from two-handed swords down to sort of hand-and-a-half swords, down to little one-handed short-arming swords and hatchets. And in fact, this concept of obsidian blades mounted into a wooden body was carried all the way further, just outside swords, but into weapons more akin to glaives and halberds. And this leads to a variant called the tepos topoli. I might be pronouncing that vaguely correctly, which is essentially, like I say, the glaive version. So you take the Makawito and you stick it on a pole, much like in many other parts of the world when you've invented a sword, you say, let's stick it on a long stick, and you end up with a polearm. So another amazing type of stone weapon, which it seems that not a lot of people in the West actually really seem to know about these days, and really should, is a type of slate dagger from Korea. That's right, so they're made of slate. Now, they are, again, Bronze Age, and they are made in the form of bronze knives. Now, to set some context, at this time, bronze weapons were available in Korea, but it seems that people were being buried with, and in some cases using, in some way or another, slate daggers, and they were putting huge amounts of effort into making these things. So why? Well, it could have been that bronze was still highly valuable and there wasn't enough of it around. So people who couldn't afford bronze daggers had the slate daggers made in the form of a bronze dagger? Possibly. Perhaps bronze daggers were being worn as status objects, and so therefore they wanted to wear a dagger as a status object, but they couldn't afford a bronze one. Perhaps there just wasn't enough bronze to go around. Or it's possible that the slate daggers were purely ritual, and possibly the reason that we find them is because they were being buried, and possibly they were being made as burial goods. The only thing which goes against that is some of them show signs of use and resharpening and things like this. So it does seem that people were using them, probably. There's a lot of questions that we can't answer about these things, but they are absolutely incredible. There's actually a vast number of them being found in Korea, and interestingly also in Japan. And this obviously opens up questions about how Japan was populated and movements, migrations of people, because we know that there's a genetic relationship between the Koreans and the Japanese, although that's obviously a contentious subject in that part of the world these days. But the fact is that it could have been trading, or it could have been people moving. We don't know. But these slate daggers are beautifully and finely and precisely made, and come in a huge variety of different blade sizes, widths, lengths and shapes. And the hilts have a lot of different details and are often very detailed in terms of the detailing of the guard and pommel and grip sections as well. So there you go, Korean slate daggers. You can go and research more about those if you want to know more. So the final stone weapon in this group that I want to tell you about is the Mapuche clava. The Mapuche are the people, and they live in Chile in South America. And the clava is a type of small crescent-shaped hand club, a little bit like one of these, and in fact they're usually made of stone. Okay, so it seems that most of them are made of slate, but they can be made of other types of stone, and yet again they have huge ritual significance, but their overall form and shape has meant that some people have said that this is a possible piece of evidence connecting them with the Maori, and obviously the migrations of people that moved down to what's now New Zealand, all the way down from places like Hawaii originally. So indeed, it is absolutely possible. There is a direct connection. You can see we've gone full circle here between the Maui Pu or Mere and the Mapuche clava. So we're now in Chile. Now, these clubs, they, as far as we know in historical periods, they've been almost entirely been used as symbols, like badges of office. So in other words, a symbol of being a boss, a chief. They're made of stone, they're carved somewhat elaborately, but they've got a very characteristic shape, so characteristic in fact that there are even, you know, statues and sculptures and stuff in Chile of it. It's essentially a national symbol. And but undoubtedly originally they started off as weapons. So while they have a sort of ritual, symbolic, ceremonial significance now, they almost certainly were weapons, much like the patu was originally, and probably are a way back prehistoric root connection between weapons we find in Hawaii, all the way down the coast of the Americas and all the way down to New Zealand as well. And thanks once again to Warhammer 40,000 Tacticus for sponsoring this video. Remember, the download for free, links and special offer down below in the description and also in the pinned comment. So thanks for joining me for this video. There are, of course, a whole bunch more stone weapons, and as mentioned at the beginning, I haven't touched on really stone spears and stone arrowheads because they're pretty much universal to humans around the planet. But hopefully some of these weapons are new to you and will give you a springboard to go into some new research. Are there some that I missed that you would have loved to see on here? I know there are, of course, other stone weapons which I couldn't include in this selection of 10. I have to be somewhat selective, but are there certain things you would like me to do a deeper dive on in the future? I'm happy to. I will almost certainly be doing a deeper dive on the Mesoamerican, the Makawito kind of relatives, because they are a very, very fascinating subject. But are there any other areas? And I'll probably be doing a deep dive on Maori weapons at some point as well. Hopefully you've enjoyed my wooden weapons, now my stone weapons. What would you like me to look at next? Thanks a lot for watching. Please make sure you're subscribed. Give me a thumbs up because it means a lot. It makes a big, big difference to my happiness. And I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks!